I'm not exactly sure when things started to go wrong. Maybe it was a gradual thing, something I didn't notice because I was too busy, too distracted, or just plain naive. But looking back now, I can see the signs were there. We had been married for 14 years, and I thought everything was fine. We had a house in the suburbs, two grown kids off to college, and a dog named Buddy. Life was comfortable, predictable, even a bit boring sometimes. But that's how life gets after so many years, right? At least that's what I thought. My wife, Laura, and I met in our mid-20s. She was beautiful, smart, and had this fiery personality that drew people to her. I was the quiet one, more of a listener than a talker. Our dynamic worked. Her confidence balanced my calm. I loved her deeply, and for a long time, I believed she felt the same. But that was before everything started to shift, before the late nights at the office, the business trips, and the constant distance that seemed to grow between us. It was subtle at first. Laura had always been driven, working her way up the corporate ladder in marketing. Her job demanded long hours, but I was proud of her success. I didn't mind picking up the slack at home. I cooked, cleaned, and handled most of the housework. It felt like a partnership. At least I convinced myself it was. But over time, something changed. Laura became distant, cold even. She was always on her phone, and when I'd ask who she was texting, she'd brush me off. Just work stuff, she'd say, barely looking up. Then there were the weekend trips she claimed were for networking or conferences. I didn't question her at first. Why would I? We'd been together for over a decade. I trusted her. But that trust started to erode slowly. It wasn't one big event that made me suspicious. It was a series of small things that added up. I noticed she was spending more money than usual. New clothes, expensive perfumes, things she didn't use at home. She became more secretive with her phone, always keeping it face down or taking it with her even to the bathroom. I'd catch her smiling at her screen sometimes, and when I asked what was so funny, she'd quickly put it away and change the subject. I remember one particular night about 6 months ago. She came home late again. She smelled like a mix of alcohol and something else, something unfamiliar. I asked her how her work dinner went, and she gave me the same robotic answer she always did. It was fine, just a long day. I wanted to believe her, but my gut told me something was off. Still, I said nothing. I didn't want to seem paranoid or jealous. But that feeling in my stomach wouldn't go away. The real tipping point came when I found her phone unlocked on the kitchen counter. She'd left it there while she ran out to grab groceries. I wasn't the type to snoop, but something inside me, a nagging suspicion, told me to look. So I did. I scrolled through her texts and found one from someone named James. I didn't recognize the name, but the messages were intimate, flirtatious. Things like, "I miss you already," and "last night was amazing." My heart dropped into my stomach. This wasn't just some casual work colleague. This was something more, something deeper. My wife was cheating on me. I put the phone back down where I found it, my hands shaking. I didn't confront her that day. I couldn't. I needed time to think, to process what I had just discovered. But from that moment on, everything between us felt different. I became hyper-aware of her every move, every word. I started watching her more closely, noticing how often she'd check her phone, how she'd avoid my gaze when she came home late. I knew I had to find out the truth. After finding that text from James, I couldn't look at Laura the same way. The betrayal felt like a punch to the gut, but I couldn't confront her. Not yet. I needed more proof, something concrete, because deep down, part of me still didn't want to believe it. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was just harmless flirting. But another part of me, the part that couldn't stop replaying that message in my head, knew it was more than that. I became a detective in my own home. I started paying attention to the little details, things I used to overlook. I'd check her phone bills when they came in, noting the frequent late-night calls to numbers I didn't recognize. I'd casually ask about her work trips, listening closely to how vague she'd become about the details. It was like she was rehearsing a script, and the cracks in her story were beginning to show. The more I dug, the more suspicious I became. One night, while she was in the shower, I decided to go through her purse, a move that made me feel sick to my stomach. I hated being this guy, the one who snoops, but I had to know. Inside, I found something that stopped me cold, a receipt from a local restaurant dated 2 days ago. It wasn't for a dinner for one, it was for two. Wine, steak, dessert, the works. And the kicker? It wasn't even a place she had mentioned being at. That night, she had told me she was working late. I was angry, sure, but more than that, I felt humiliated. She was living this whole other life right under my nose. I couldn't just sit around anymore, hoping for answers. I needed to catch her in the act. A few weeks later, Laura told me she had another work trip coming up. This time, she'd be gone for the entire weekend, supposedly meeting clients out of town. I acted like I believed her, wished her a safe trip, and even helped her pack. But I wasn't about to let her get away so easily. I took the Monday off work and hired a private investigator. I needed real evidence, something that would leave no doubt. The investigator, a guy named Mike, was discreet and professional. He agreed to follow her and report back on anything suspicious. I figured it would be a few days before I'd hear from him. But to my surprise, Mike called me the very next day. His voice was serious. "You're going to want to sit down for this," he said. I felt my stomach churn. "What did you find?" I asked, trying to steady my voice. "She didn't leave town," he said. "She's been staying at a house about 20 minutes from here. And she's not alone." I blinked, not sure I had heard him right. "What do you mean she's not alone? Who's she with?" Mike paused for a second. "A man and a child." I felt like the ground had just been ripped out from under me. "A child?" I repeated, my mind spinning. "She doesn't have a child, except ours, obviously." "I know it sounds crazy," Mike said, "but I've been following her for the past day. She's been going in and out of this house, spending time with a man and a little boy, maybe around 5 or 6 years old. From what I can tell, they look pretty close." The room started spinning, and I had to sit down. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the phone. This wasn't just about an affair anymore. This was something much worse. Laura had a child on the side? A whole other family? The thought was too insane to comprehend. "I need proof," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'll get you everything," Mike said. "Photos, videos, whatever you need. But from what I've seen, I don't think this is a one-time thing. She's been with this guy for a while." I hung up the phone and just sat there numb. How long had this been going on? Had she been lying to me our entire marriage? And who was this kid? Could it really be Laura's? I thought about the timing. 6 years ago, around the time she started taking more frequent work trips. Could that be when she started seeing him? I didn't sleep that night. My mind wouldn't stop racing with questions I had no answers to. The next day, Mike sent me the photos. There was Laura, walking out of a small house in a neighborhood I didn't recognize, holding the hand of a little boy with dark hair. The man beside her, presumably James, was laughing, his arm casually slung around her shoulders. She looked happy, happier than she'd looked in years. I stared at the photos for what felt like hours. This was proof that my wife was living a double life. But the part that hurt the most wasn't that she had cheated on me with some guy. It was the kid. She had a son, possibly his son, and she never even told me. The betrayal was almost too much to bear. I wanted to scream, to confront her, to make her feel the same pain she had inflicted on me. But I didn't. Instead, I started planning my next move. I wasn't just going to confront her about the affair. No, I wanted her to feel the full weight of her betrayal. I wanted to take everything from her, just like she had taken everything from me. Her career, her reputation, her life. I was going to burn it all to the ground, and she wouldn't even see it coming. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't bring myself to look at Laura the same way, knowing what I knew. She went about her life as if everything was normal, completely unaware that her secret was about to come crashing down. She'd text me from work, tell me she'd be home late, and I'd nod along, pretending like I believed her. But inside, the anger was bubbling up, ready to explode. I spent most of my free time with Mike, gathering more information. Every photo, every piece of evidence, only fueled my desire for revenge. I didn't want to just leave her. I wanted to ruin her. I wanted her to feel what I felt. The pain, the betrayal, the humiliation. And I had the perfect plan. First, I needed to confirm the identity of the man, James. Mike did some digging and found out that his real name was James Turner. He was a regional manager at some tech company downtown, a name I'd never heard Laura mention. But the deeper Mike went, the worse it got. James was married. That little boy? He wasn't just Laura's secret child, he was theirs. James and his wife had been married for 8 years, and their son, Max, was 6. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Not only was Laura living a double life with this guy, but she was also screwing over his wife and kid in the process. My head spun as I thought about it. Laura had been sneaking off to play house with some other man's family. And me? I was the fool, cleaning up the mess back home, thinking she was just stressed from work. Well, if she wanted to destroy our family, I'd make sure she destroyed theirs too. I started to piece together my plan, and every time I thought about how Laura's world would crumble, a sense of calm washed over me. I had always been the nice guy, the understanding husband, the one who put up with her career ambitions, her late nights, and her constant excuses. But not anymore. This time, I was taking control. First, I started laying the groundwork for the financial fallout. Laura had always been a bit careless with money, so it wasn't hard to start tracking her accounts. I had access to everything: joint bank accounts, credit cards, her personal investments. I was patient. I made small withdrawals, nothing big enough to catch her attention, just enough to start siphoning off cash. When the time came, I'd hit her hard where it hurt: her wallet. Next, I made a copy of the evidence: photos, text messages, everything Mike had collected. I kept one copy for myself and prepared another to send anonymously to James's wife. She deserved to know the truth about her husband, just like I had learned the truth about my wife. But I wasn't going to send it just yet. I had to make sure everything was lined up perfectly. The final piece of my plan involved her job. Laura was always bragging about how vital she was at work, how they couldn't function without her. But I knew better. She had made enemies over the years, people who would love to see her fall from grace. I reached out to a few of her co-workers, pretending to be concerned about her strange behavior and hinting at some irregularities in her work. One call to HR, and suddenly, there were whispers about an investigation into her travel expenses. Everything was falling into place. But there was one thing I hadn't anticipated: the guilt. As angry as I was, as much as I wanted to hurt Laura, I couldn't stop thinking about the boy. Mux. He had no idea what was going on. He was just an innocent kid caught in the middle of this mess. The thought of ripping his family apart made me pause. But then I remembered the photos of Laura with him, laughing, holding his hand. She had chosen this. She had put me and that little boy into this nightmare. And for that, there was no forgiveness. The weekend before I planned to confront her, we went out to dinner. A normal family dinner, the kind we used to have all the time. I don't know why I suggested it. Maybe it was to test myself, to see if I could sit across from her and pretend nothing was wrong. Or maybe it was because I wanted to see if she'd even notice how cold I had become. We sat at our usual table at a nice restaurant downtown. Laura was smiling, chatting about her upcoming trip to Chicago. I watched her talk, wondering how she could sit there and lie so easily. It almost made me sick. I didn't say much, just nodded along, pushing food around my plate. When she asked me if everything was okay, I plastered on a smile and said, "Just tired." "Yeah, I get it," she said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "Work's been draining for both of us." I almost laughed. If only she knew what was coming. The next morning, I got up early, even before she did. Laura was leaving that day for another work trip, and I wanted to make sure everything was ready. As she packed her suitcase, I told her I had some errands to run and kissed her on the cheek before leaving the house. In reality, I went straight to Mike's office to pick up the last round of evidence. He had done good work. Photos of Laura sneaking into James's house, the two of them at restaurants, and even a video of her picking Max up from school one afternoon. It was enough to blow up her entire world. When I got back home, Laura was already gone. She had left me a note on the kitchen counter, the same generic farewell she always left. "See you Sunday. I love you." I crumpled it up and tossed it in the trash. It was time. Laura was gone for her work trip, and I sat in the quiet of our home, the note she left still crumpled in the trash. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, the moment everything came crashing down for her. I had all the evidence, all the pieces of the puzzle lined up perfectly. Now it was time to put it all into motion. But first, I needed to make sure her double life was as destroyed as the one she had been pretending to live with me. I wasn't just going to ruin her life with a simple confrontation. No, this had to be something she couldn't recover from. I started by sending the anonymous package to James's wife. The photos of him and Laura, along with a letter explaining everything. How long it had been going on, the lies, the deceit, and their secret child. I didn't hold back. His wife deserved to know the truth. I couldn't imagine the pain she was going to feel, but it was better than living in the dark like I had been. With that done, I turned my focus to Laura's job. I had already planted the seeds of doubt among her co-workers in HR, but now it was time to water those seeds. I drafted an anonymous email, carefully detailing her travel expenses that didn't add up, her meetings with clients that didn't exist. I included the photos of her and James together on one of her supposed business trips. It wouldn't take much for HR to connect the dots and launch an investigation. If I was lucky, she'd be fired by the time she returned from her trip. But as satisfying as it was to set all these wheels in motion, there was one thing left to do: confront Laura. I wasn't going to let her sneak out of this without facing the consequences. The plan was simple. I would wait for her to return from her weekend with James and their son. Let her think everything was normal for a day or two. Then, I'd confront her with the evidence, every lie, every betrayal, and watch her world crumble. I knew she was coming back on Sunday afternoon, so I spent the weekend preparing myself mentally. The anger that had been building up inside me for weeks was now more like a cold, calculating determination. I wasn't going to yell or scream. I was going to be calm, composed, and completely in control. I wanted her to feel small, powerless, just like she had made me feel when I discovered the truth. Sunday arrived, and I sat on the couch, pretending to watch football, though my mind was elsewhere. Laura came through the door, her usual bright smile plastered on her face. She kissed me on the cheek, dropped her suitcase by the stairs, and immediately started talking about her trip. "I'm exhausted," she said, stretching her arms above her head. "That conference was so boring. I swear, I almost fell asleep during one of the sessions." I just nodded, keeping my eyes on the TV. "Long weekend, huh?" I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. She didn't even look suspicious. Why would she? She had no idea what was coming. "Yeah, but at least it's over," she sighed. "I'm just glad to be home." Home. The word felt like poison coming out of her mouth. How could she stand there and say that after spending the weekend with another man and his son, living out her fantasy life? We had dinner together that night, just like any other Sunday. She was relaxed, talking about work, about life, about mundane things I couldn't care less about anymore. The whole time, I kept my poker face, not giving her a single hint of what was coming. That night, when we went to bed, she snuggled up next to me, as if nothing had changed, as if we were still a happy couple. I felt a wave of disgust wash over me, but stayed silent, staring at the ceiling, counting down the hours until I could finally confront her. The next morning, I woke up early, as usual, but instead of heading to work, I sat at the kitchen table, waiting. Laura came downstairs, dressed for the office, her phone in hand as she scrolled through her emails. She smiled at me, completely unaware that her life was about to implode. I cleared my throat. "We need to talk." She glanced up, her smile fading a little. "About what?" she asked, clearly confused. "About your trips. About James. About the child." Her face went pale instantly, like all the blood had drained out of her. She stood frozen, her eyes wide with shock. What are you talking about?" she stammered, but the lie was weak, and we both knew it. I didn't say anything. I just reached into the drawer next to me, pulled out the envelope with all the photos, and slid it across the table to her. She stared at it, her hand trembling as she reached for it. The silence was suffocating as she opened the envelope and pulled out the photos. One by one, she flipped through them, her expression going from shock to disbelief to horror. "Who's James?" I asked, my voice calm but firm. "And who's the little boy?" Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked at me, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to find words. But there were no excuses left for her to give, no lies that could cover up what she had done. "How long?" I asked, my voice cold. "How long have you been living this double life?" She broke down, sobbing into her hands. I'm so sorry," she cried, but I wasn't moved. I had been preparing for this moment for weeks, and no amount of tears could change what I had learned. "Sorry doesn't cut it," I said, leaning forward, keeping my voice steady. You lied to me, to our kids. You've been sneaking around with another man, and you have a child with him. How long did you think you could keep this up, Laura? Did you think I wouldn't find out? She shook her head, her words barely coherent through her sobs. It's not what you think, Dan. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I laughed bitterly. Not what I think. Laura, you've been lying to me for years. You've been living two lives. You don't just accidentally have a child with another man. The guilt was written all over her face, but I wasn't done. I've already contacted James's wife, I said, watching the shock register on her face. She knows everything. Your little fantasy life? It's over. And your job? I've already tipped off your HR department. They're looking into your travel expenses. You won't have a career to go back to. Her eyes widened in horror, realizing the full extent of what I had done. Dan, please, we can work this out, she begged, reaching for my hand. I'll do anything. Just don't leave me. I pulled my hand away, disgusted. Work this out? I repeated, incredulous. You destroyed our family, Laura. There's no working this out. I stood up, pushing my chair back as I walked toward the door. I'll be filing for divorce today, I said, my voice cold. You'll be hearing from my lawyer. You can explain all of this to your family, if they'll even speak to you after this. With that, I turned and left her there, sobbing at the kitchen table, knowing that her entire world had just come crashing down. And for the first time in weeks, I felt free. Walking out of that kitchen, leaving Laura sobbing behind me, felt like the final step in reclaiming control over my life. For weeks, I'd been simmering with rage, feeling like my whole world was falling apart. But now, after confronting her, I felt a strange sense of calm, as though the storm had finally passed. The only thing left to do was to finish the job. I headed straight to my lawyer's office. I had been preparing for this moment for a while now, knowing it would come to this once I had all the evidence. The lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense guy named Alan, greeted me with a firm handshake. We went over the documents, and I made it clear I wanted everything handled quickly and ruthlessly. No second chances, no dragging things out. I was done. Given the evidence we've got on her, Alan said, flipping through the stack of photos and records, the divorce should be pretty straightforward. You'll have a strong case for getting most of the assets, especially since she's been using marital funds for her affair. And with her job being at risk now, we can argue that she won't be financially stable enough to contest the settlement. I nodded, my eyes on the paperwork. What about the house? I want to keep it. She can go live with James, or whoever the hell she wants. I don't care. You're in a good position to claim the house, Alan confirmed, especially if she's the one at fault. As for custody, he paused, looking at me thoughtfully. Your kids are adults now, but if you want to prevent her from having too much influence on their lives, we can make sure the divorce settlement makes it clear where you stand. I'm not sure about the kids, I said, the weight of the situation suddenly hitting me. They're old enough to make their own decisions, but I don't want them getting caught up in her lies. I'm going to tell them everything, but they need to hear it from me, not from her. Wise choice, Alan said, scribbling a note. This whole thing is going to be a mess for her. You'll come out on top, Dan. But be prepared. Divorces like this tend to get ugly. Ugly was an understatement. I knew that once the papers were served, Laura would fight to save face. But there was no way she could undo the damage she had done. I left Alan's office feeling strangely at peace, knowing that I was finally moving forward. When I got home that afternoon, Laura was gone. I didn't expect her to still be there. She had probably run off somewhere to lick her wounds, maybe to James's place. But I didn't care. I wasn't going to play her games anymore. Instead, I texted both of our kids, asking them to come home for dinner that night. It was time they knew the truth. By the time they arrived, I had calmed myself down, rehearsed what I was going to say. Our daughter, Emily, showed up first, followed by our son, Jake. Both of them walked in, smiling, oblivious to the storm that was about to hit. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I had confronted Laura earlier that day. The air was thick with tension, but I needed to tell them what was happening before Laura got to them with her version of the story. There's something we need to talk about, I began, keeping my voice steady. They both looked at me, concerned but patient. Your mother and I are getting a divorce. Their reactions were immediate. Emily gasped, her eyes filling with shock, while Jake just stared at me, his face unreadable. What? Why? Emily asked, her voice shaky. You guys seem fine. What happened? I took a deep breath. Your mother's been having an affair. For years, apparently. She's been lying to me, to all of us. I found out recently, and it's worse than you think. I saw the confusion and hurt flash across their faces. Jake leaned forward, his brow furrowed. Worse how? There's another family involved, I said quietly. She's been seeing a man named James, and they have a child together. Both of them froze, the weight of my words sinking in. Emily's face went pale, her mouth slightly open in disbelief. Jake clenched his jaw, his hands tightening into fists. A child? Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. Yes, I said, looking them both in the eyes. She's been living a double life. I don't know how long exactly, but it's been going on for years. I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but you deserve to know the truth. Emily burst into tears, covering her face with her hands. Jake, on the other hand, remained stone-faced, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. He stood up abruptly, pacing the room. How could she do this? Jake muttered, his fists clenched. All those trips, all those lies. And we didn't know. How the hell did we not know? I didn't have an answer for him. The truth was none of us had known. Laura had fooled all of us, weaving her web of lies so tightly that we didn't even see it coming. I watched Emily cry, her body shaking with sobs, and I felt my own heart breaking for them. They didn't deserve this. None of us did. Jake finally stopped pacing, his face red with anger. I can't believe it. What kind of person does that? Does she even care about us? About you? I don't know, I admitted. But what matters now is that we move forward. I'm divorcing her, and I want you both to know that this has nothing to do with either of you. She made her choices, and now she's going to have to live with the consequences. Emily wiped her eyes, looking up at me. Have you talked to her? What is she going to do? She doesn't have much of a choice, I said, keeping my tone calm. Her career is about to implode, and I've already exposed the affair to James's wife. There's no going back for her. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of it all hanging in the air. I could see the pain in their faces, the betrayal, the confusion. It was going to take time for them to process this, to understand the full impact of what their mother had done. I'm sorry, I said softly. I wish I didn't have to tell you this, but you deserve to know the truth. Emily got up and hugged me, her tears soaking into my shirt. Jake stood there for a moment longer, his fists still clenched, before finally walking over and pulling me into a stiff embrace. We'll get through this, Dad, he said, his voice rough with emotion. We'll get through it. I nodded, feeling a lump rise in my throat. Yeah, I whispered. We will. The next day, the storm I had set in motion finally hit Laura's life. I got a call from Alan, my lawyer, who was grinning on the other end of the line. The papers were served this morning, he said. And let me tell you, it wasn't pretty. Apparently, Laura had been at her office when a courier delivered the divorce papers right to her desk. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. It was during a meeting with her boss. The look of shock on her face must have been priceless. Alan chuckled as he described the scene. I've also been in touch with HR over at her company. Looks like they've officially launched an investigation into her travel expenses. It's only a matter of time before she's suspended or fired. I hung up, feeling a surge of satisfaction. This was what she deserved. All of it. And then, just as I was about to breathe a sigh of relief, my phone buzzed with a new message. It was from James's wife. I got the package. Thank you for letting me know. We're going to need to talk. It seemed like the fallout wasn't over yet. After I got the message from James's wife, reality hit me. This nightmare wasn't over yet. While the divorce papers had been served, and her job was teetering on the edge, the next steps still lay ahead. My revenge was complete, at least in terms of bringing down Laura's facade, but I wasn't prepared for how swiftly everything around her would collapse. Laura didn't come home that night. The house was eerily quiet. I half expected her to barge in, screaming, demanding to know why I had destroyed her career, why I'd blown up her relationship with James. But there was nothing. I sat on the couch, waiting, feeling like the calm before the storm. The next morning, my phone rang again. This time it was my son, Jake. "Dad," he said, his voice low. "I got a call from Mom this morning. She's a mess." I felt a surge of emotions rise in my chest. Anger, pity, sadness. What did she say? "She's staying at a hotel downtown. She begged me to come see her. I guess James kicked her out after his wife found out about the affair. Everything's falling apart for her." I didn't feel the satisfaction I thought I would. There was no joy in hearing that James had cut ties with her. I had wanted to ruin her life, and now that it was happening, it felt different than I expected. There was no rush of victory, just an empty pit in my stomach. "Are you going to see her?" I asked, trying to gauge Jake's mood. "I don't know," he admitted. "Emily and I have been talking. She's crushed, Dad. Emily doesn't even know if she can face Mom right now." "I understand," I said. "I don't blame either of you for how you feel. Take your time, but just know that whatever happens, I'm here for you." "I know, Dad," Jake said softly, "but it's still hard." That was an understatement. This wasn't just about Laura and me anymore. Our kids were caught in the middle of it, and no matter what, they still love their mother. That complicated things in ways I hadn't anticipated. They had a right to see her, to hear her side of the story, even if I couldn't stand the thought of what she might say to justify her betrayal. After I hung up, I tried to go about my day, but my mind kept drifting back to Laura. Was she really staying at some hotel, isolated and alone, her life crumbling around her? Or was she scheming, trying to figure out how to salvage what little she had left? Around midday, my phone buzzed again. This time it was Laura. I stared at the screen for a long moment before answering. "Dan," she said, her voice weak, barely above a whisper. "Please, can we talk?" I paused, unsure if I was ready for what she had to say. But after a long silence, I replied, "Fine. Where are you?" She told me the name of the hotel. I knew the place, nothing fancy, just a cheap room off the interstate. I agreed to meet her there in an hour. I pulled into the parking lot of the hotel, my heart heavy as I walked toward room 214. I wasn't sure what to expect. Would she be angry? Desperate? Apologetic? Part of me didn't care anymore. I just wanted this chapter of my life to be over. I knocked on the door, and after a few seconds, it creaked open. Laura stood there, looking nothing like the confident woman I had known for so many years. Her face was pale, her eyes red and puffy from crying, her clothes wrinkled and disheveled. For the first time in a long time, she looked vulnerable. "Come in," she said quietly, stepping aside. I walked into the small, dingy room. There were takeout containers on the table, a half-empty bottle of wine, and the curtains were drawn, casting the room in a dim, suffocating light. I sat down on the edge of the bed, and she sat across from me in a chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. For a few moments, we just stared at each other, neither of us knowing how to start. Finally, she broke the silence. "I know you hate me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "And I don't blame you." I didn't respond immediately. I just watched her, waiting for her to continue. "I never meant for this to happen," she said, her eyes welling up with tears. "I didn't plan it. I didn't want to hurt you or the kids. It got out of control." "Out of control?" I said, my voice calm but hard. "You've been living a double life, Laura. You have a child with another man. How long did you think you could keep this up?" She winced at my words, wiping a tear from her cheek. "I was selfish. I know that now. I didn't think about how much damage I was doing. I thought I could handle it, that I could keep the two parts of my life separate. But I was wrong." I shook my head, disbelief still gripping me. "So, what was the plan? Stay with me, lie to me, and sneak away to play house with James and his family?" She sobbed quietly, her head hanging in shame. "No, I didn't want it to be like this. I didn't mean for it to go so far. At first, it was just an affair, but then things got complicated, and I didn't know how to stop." "That's where you're wrong," I said, my voice cold. "You always had a choice, Laura. You could have stopped at any time. But you didn't. You kept lying, kept betraying me, kept stringing me along like a fool." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with regret. "I'm sorry, Dan. I really am. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know that I'm sorry." "Sorry isn't enough," I replied, my words sharp. You've destroyed everything. Our marriage, our family, your career. What do you have left? I don't know, she whispered, breaking down into sobs. I don't know. There was a long silence between us. I wanted to feel satisfaction, to see her suffering and feel like justice had been served. But all I felt was sadness. This was the woman I had loved for years, the woman I had built a life with. And now, here we were, everything in ruins. I'm filing for divorce, I said, standing up. There's nothing left to say. You can explain everything to the kids. I've already told them what they need to know. She nodded weakly, not protesting. There was nothing she could say that would change my mind. The damage was done, and there was no fixing it. I'll be staying at the house, I added. You need to figure out what you're going to do. Maybe James will take you back, but I doubt it. She didn't respond. She just sat there, staring at the floor, broken and defeated. I turned and walked to the door. Before I left, I glanced back at her one last time. Goodbye, Laura. She didn't look up. She just whispered, Goodbye, Dan. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal meetings, paperwork, and uncomfortable conversations. The divorce process was fast-tracked, thanks to the overwhelming evidence of Laura's infidelity. My lawyer made sure I got the house, and Laura's career crumbled after the HR investigation confirmed her misuse of company funds. As for James, his wife had left him, taking their son with her. Last I heard, Laura and James were no longer in contact. His life had imploded just like hers. The hardest part was dealing with the kids. Emily barely spoke to Laura anymore, heartbroken by the betrayal. Jake was angrier, but more protective of his sister, doing his best to shield her from the emotional fallout. They both stayed close to me, and we spent more time together than we had in years, leaning on each other to get through the mess. One evening, about a month after everything had blown up, I sat on the back porch with Buddy, watching the sun set over the horizon. The house felt different now, quieter, emptier, but in a way, more peaceful. I had started seeing a therapist, working through the emotions I had buried during the divorce, and it was helping. Slowly, I was beginning to feel like myself again. I still thought about Laura sometimes, not in a longing way, but in the sense of a life I had once lived, now gone. She had been a huge part of my life for so many years, and it was impossible to just erase that history. But I didn't miss her. Not anymore. Jake and Emily were visiting that weekend, and as I sat there on the porch, I heard the sound of their laughter coming from inside the house. It was a comforting sound, one that reminded me that despite everything, I still had a family. One that mattered. I had survived the storm. Laura had lost everything. But for me, life was moving forward. Months passed, and the dust finally began to settle. Laura moved out of state, leaving behind the wreckage of her former life. She found a low-paying job in another city, far from the world she had built and destroyed here. I didn't hear much about her after that, and honestly, I didn't care to. The chapter of our lives together was closed, and she had become little more than a distant memory. As for me, life took on a new rhythm. The house felt different without Laura's presence, quieter, but in a way that felt more like peace than loneliness. I focused on rebuilding my life, picking up the pieces of what she had shattered. Therapy helped me work through the anger and the pain, and slowly, I began to feel like myself again. I stopped questioning why it had all happened, stopped wondering what I could have done differently. There was no use in dwelling on the past. Jake and Emily stayed close, visiting often and keeping me grounded. We talked more than we had in years, leaning on each other as we adjusted to our new reality. It wasn't easy for them. They were still processing the betrayal, but we were healing together. Their laughter returned to the house, and with it, a sense of warmth that I hadn't felt in a long time. I found myself enjoying the simple things again. Sitting on the back porch with Buddy at my side, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. There was no more pretending, no more living under the weight of Laura's lies. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. Eventually, I started dating again. It wasn't something I rushed into, but when I met someone who shared similar experiences, someone who had also been through a betrayal, I realized that moving on didn't mean forgetting. It meant learning to trust again, to let go of the bitterness, and to believe that something better could still come from the ashes of the past. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine again. The storm that Laura had brought into my life had passed, and in its place was a calm I never thought I'd find. Moving on didn't mean erasing the past, but it did mean stepping into the future with a heart that was no longer weighed down by the hurt she'd caused. In the end, I hadn't just survived, I had rebuilt, and that was enough.